Hello guys, I'm Tom, and today we're going to take a look at what happened to Derry after Pennywise. One of the most unsettling, disturbing, and at the same time fascinating aspects that Stephen King develops in it is not limited solely to the figure of Pennywise as the central antagonist, but to something far more difficult to process. The consequences that his defeat leaves embedded in the very fabric of the town of Derry. Beyond the final confrontation and the apparent victory of the Losers Club, the novel raises a deeply uncomfortable and almost existential question. What truly happens to a community that has spent entire generations living under the influence of a cosmic, parasitic, and manipulative entity? King makes it clear that the story does not end when the monster is destroyed. In fact, one could argue that it is precisely at that moment when one of the most disturbing segments of the entire narrative truly begins. Once the adult members of the Losers Club manage to definitively destroy the physical manifestation of it, and more importantly, sever the link that connected Derry to that force originating from the macroverse, or macrocosm, the town is left exposed, stripped bare, without the supernatural veil that for decades had distorted its reality. This element is crucial because for years Derry functioned as a corrupted yet stable ecosystem, artificially sustained by Pennywise's presence. By cutting that connection, not only is the predator eliminated, but a structural and psychological collapse is triggered, one that the town was simply not prepared to withstand. However, this fundamental aspect of the story was largely ignored in both the 1990 miniseries and the 2019 film adaptation directed by Andy Muschietti. Both versions focus almost exclusively on the confrontation with Pennywise and the emotional closure of the Losers Club, leaving aside the deeper and more disturbing implications of what comes after. As a result, a huge number of viewers who never read the original novel, nor other Stephen King books set in Derry or its surrounding areas, are completely unaware of what truly happened to the town once the creature disappeared. And the truth is that, within the literary material, Stephen King does not present its downfall as a happy ending or an immediate liberation. Quite the opposite. Pennywise's defeat acts as a trigger that releases years, centuries, of accumulated negative energy. Derry is not healed. It is violently shaken. The author describes how, almost simultaneously, the town is struck by two devastating consequences that appear to be directly linked to the entity's disappearance. On one hand, a natural disaster of catastrophic proportions occurs, an event so extreme that it reshapes Derry's physical landscape and leaves visible scars on its architecture and its history. On the other hand, a collective psychological alteration takes place, a kind of mental realignment that affects virtually every resident of the town, radically altering their perception of reality, of the past, and of the horrors that had been part of their everyday lives without them ever being fully aware of it. These repercussions do not impact the town solely as an abstract entity. They also leave deep marks on the members of the Losers Club themselves. Despite surviving the final confrontation and fulfilling the promise that bound them since childhood, none of them emerges truly unscathed. Victory comes at a cost, and that cost manifests itself both in the loss of memories and in a gradual disconnection between them and the place they once called home. Furthermore, after entire decades marked by moral corruption, concealed violence, ignored crimes, and the constant psychological manipulation exerted by it, Derry ultimately becomes a kind of supernatural hotspot. Even without Pennywise acting directly, the town was already deeply contaminated. Evil had taken root, and so, although the monster may be gone, the danger does not vanish completely. This is precisely why it is so important to analyze what happened immediately after the creature's defeat, what psychological consequences the residents suffered, and why Derry remained an unsettling and potentially dangerous place, even after its greatest threat seemed to have been eliminated. That being said, it's time to dive directly into the events themselves. The novel recounts that almost immediately after it is finally confronted and defeated by the adult members of the Losers Club, something completely unexpected occurs. In a surprisingly short span of time, almost as if the artificial balance sustaining the town had suddenly collapsed, Pennywise's fall unleashes a natural catastrophe of overwhelming violence. Derry begins to crumble, quite literally, from its very foundations. It doesn't take long before the most brutal storm ever recorded in the history of the state of Maine strikes the region. This climatic phenomenon is not presented as a simple weather event, but as an almost symbolic force, a violent release of all the energy that had been contained for generations. The storm tears through vast areas of the town, causing massive and chaotic destruction. Downtown Derry becomes one of the hardest-hit areas. Old buildings, many of them steeped in history and forgotten tragedies, collapse completely, reduced to little more than piles of rubble. Entire streets become unrecognizable, as if the town were being erased and rewritten at the same time. Among the most symbolically significant locations affected by the storm is the Standpipe, Derry's water tower. This place had carried a deeply sinister reputation for decades. Over the years, numerous children who went there, whether to swim, explore, or simply out of curiosity, ended up drowning under strange circumstances. The novel strongly suggests that these deaths were not isolated accidents, but the direct result of its supernatural influence and its ability to distort the minds of both the victims and the adults who later ignored or downplayed what had happened. From this perspective, the complete destruction of the water tower can be interpreted as more than mere collateral damage. It represents the definitive collapse of one of the clearest symbols of Pennywise's dominion over Derry. It is as if the town were losing at the same time a physical monument and an open wound from its past. Similarly, the Tracker Brothers warehouse is completely destroyed. This site carries enormous symbolic weight within the story, as it is the setting for several of the most crucial and traumatic encounters with the creature. It is also the backdrop for one of the most intense and dangerous moments in the novel, Eddie's direct confrontation with it, a scene that encapsulates both the physical and psychological horror that defines the work. In the same way, in the novel Dreamcatcher, Stephen King drops a detail that, although it may seem minor at first glance, takes on enormous weight when analyzed within the framework of his shared universe. The group of protagonist friends meets Duddits precisely in the abandoned parking lot of that warehouse, a space already marked by a sense of neglect, silence, and decay. This is not a casual coincidence, but rather another geographical point where the lines of horror, trauma, and the supernatural intersect once again. That seemingly harmless location ultimately becomes a narrative node where fundamental events from different stories converge. And it is precisely because of this accumulation of meaning, because it has become a point of contact between forces that should not coexist, that the space ends up being completely obliterated. The destruction of the warehouse and its parking lot does not appear to be the result of chance or simple collateral damage, but rather a kind of cosmic correction, as if the very fabric of reality needed to erase any setting where horror had taken root too deeply. Another of the places devastated by the storm, whose origin is clearly supernatural, was the house located at 29 Niebolt Street. This site is not only one of the most iconic settings in it, but also one of the most heavily burdened with dark history. As explained in the novel, the house had been built on cursed ground, land marked since colonial times by the disappearance of pilgrims and settlers, people who simply vanished without a trace during the region's earliest years of settlement. At that same location stood an ancient well that served as the main entrance to its lair, the direct access point to the network of tunnels and sewers where the entity had established its dominion. During the final catastrophe, the house collapses completely, disappearing without leaving any visible trace behind. No ruins remain, no recognizable foundations. Along with it, the entire subterranean network that for decades served as Pennywise's refuge, burrow, and operational center is also lost. The total disappearance of this system is not merely an act of physical destruction. It symbolizes the definitive eradication of the heart of horror in Derry, the place from which the creature watched, stalked, and fed on the fear of entire generations. It is therefore logical to assume that the cavern in which the meteorite, the vessel through which Pennywise arrived on Earth, was located was also destroyed during this process of absolute devastation. That cave was not merely a geological space, but the anchoring point between our world and an entity that did not belong to it. In the same way, it is reasonable to assume that the statue of the lumberjack Paul Bunyan met the same fate, since this monument was deeply tied to Derry's history and maintained an indirect, yet significant connection to its influence, functioning as one of those seemingly harmless symbols that, in reality, concealed a deeply disturbing weight. Although the novel never explicitly confirms that the disappearance of either the cave or the statue was a direct consequence of the storm, this interpretation fits coherently with everything that occurs on both a narrative and symbolic level. The primary objective of this supernatural phenomenon appears to be singular: to completely eliminate any physical, historical, or symbolic remnant that could keep the memory or influence of it alive within the town. It is important to understand that the storm does not act in a chaotic or indiscriminate manner. It does not destroy at random. Every building that falls, every structure erased from the map, seems to be part of a deliberate and almost surgical process. Each collapse represents an attempt to eradicate the imprint that Pennywise left on Derry after decades of manipulation, violence, and cyclical terror. On a first level, a physical cleansing takes place. The spaces, locations, and symbols that served as tangible reminders of the creature's dominion over the town disappear. With them vanish sites burdened by a dark, bloody, and profoundly traumatic past, places where horror had been normalized and repeated itself over and over again as part of the city's routine. But on a deeper, more symbolic level, all of this destruction represents something even more powerful: the final release of collective fear. The fall of these places is also the fall of the psychological weight, the invisible oppression, and the mental control that it imposed on Derry for generations. The magnitude of the devastation suggests that both the town and its inhabitants are, for the first time, in a genuine position to move forward, to rebuild without the constant shadow of a threat that always returned. To truly understand what happens after the entity's definitive disappearance, it is necessary to step back and analyze the origin of it and the manner in which it arrived in our world. This is not a conventional monster nor a simple supernatural creature, but a being of cosmic nature, an ancient, superior, and profoundly malevolent entity, born in the macroverse, or macrocosm, a plane of existence that transcends our understanding of reality. It descended from that macroverse in the form of a meteorite or anomalous celestial body, violently impacting the area that would, over time, become Derry, Maine. There, its vital essence became anchored, while its true form remained outside our reality, existing in a state that could only partially manifest through the so-called deadlights, also known as the lights of death or will-o'-the-wisps. These lights were not merely a manifestation of its essence, but a bridge between dimensions, a constant reminder that Pennywise was never simply a clown, but something infinitely older, greater, and more terrifying. It is crucial to understand that its arrival in our world was not, in any sense, a minor or accidental event. It was not simply the impact of an unknown object from space, but an act of cosmic violence of immeasurable proportions, an unnatural intrusion that altered the very balance of reality itself. The entity's descent from the macroverse not only left a physical mark on Earth, but also produced a deep metaphysical wound, an invisible scar that forever transformed the place where it fell. Beneath the surface of what centuries later would become Derry, a point of supernatural convergence formed, a zone where the normal laws of space, time, and causality began to weaken. At that precise point, the barriers separating different planes of existence grew fragile and permeable, allowing anomalous interaction between realities that, under normal circumstances, should never touch. Derry was not simply built on cursed land. It was raised atop a between worlds. One of the greatest enigmas for followers of Stephen King's work arises precisely here. How was Derry able to develop as a relatively stable human settlement when its presence was already active in the region, lurking from the depths and claiming lives in a cyclical manner? This mystery becomes even more disturbing when we remember that Native American tribes had prior knowledge of the entity, had perceived its arrival, and in some cases had even experienced direct encounters with it. The warnings of the Akakapi tribe were neither vague nor superstitious. They understood that the land was contaminated by a force that did not belong to this world. Even so, European settlers ignored these signs, dismissed the danger, and moved forward with the founding of the town. However, it is difficult to believe that all of this can be attributed solely to human arrogance or cultural blindness. Everything suggests that it itself subtly manipulated human will, influencing collective decisions, steering the settlers' fate, and pushing them to establish themselves precisely where it benefited the entity the most. This was not direct control, but something far more insidious, a distortion of perception, an alteration of judgment, an irrational impulse that caused people to remain in Derry even when every indication suggested they should leave. In this way, the creature not only fed on fear, but cultivated its own human ecosystem, ensuring a constant supply of prey across entire generations. It is also essential to take into account its hibernation cycle, which occurs approximately every 27 years. Once its feeding periods were complete, the entity entered a state of deep dormancy, partially withdrawing from conscious reality. These intervals created windows of apparent normality, relatively safe spans of time during which the town could grow, rebuild after tragedies, and strengthen its infrastructure without a visible or immediate threat. During these pauses, Derry appeared to be an ordinary place. Houses were built, businesses opened, children were born, and a community took shape, functioning with an unsettling sense of routine. It cannot be ruled out that, in the early stages of the settlement's history, it deliberately restrained its more systematic attacks, waiting for the town to grow, for its population to increase, and for fear itself to multiply would have been a far more efficient strategy than an early massacre that might have driven everyone away. Whatever the definitive explanation may be, the prolonged presence of it ultimately caused a genuine cosmic fracture in the very structure of reality. Derry ceased to be a simple town and became an epicenter of horror, a place where the supernatural was not only possible, but recurrent. This condition transformed the town into the ideal setting for the entity to feed on human fear with the greatest efficiency imaginable. In a particularly disturbing way, this rift between dimensions also turned Derry and its surroundings into a magnet for other supernatural forces and manifestations. Over the years, various strange phenomena, entities, and inexplicable events began to appear in the region, as if the damage caused by its arrival had permanently weakened the defenses of the real world at that specific point. The second major effect brought about by Pennywise's definitive defeat and the dissolution of its influence was a profound shift on the mental, emotional, and psychological plane of the community. For the first time in its history, Derry began to heal. The town entered a slow and silent process of recovery, leaving behind the countless deaths, disappearances, and tragedies that had marked its existence for entire generations. This collective relief was made possible by an unsettling yet necessary phenomenon: the gradual fading of memory. Fragmented recollections, diffuse sensations of terror, and the unconscious awareness of having lived surrounded by horror began to dissolve over time. Both the social unconscious and the individual minds of each resident slowly released the unbearable weight of the past. In an irony as painful as it is profound, this same process also reached the Losers Club. After fulfilling their mission and leaving Derry, its members began to lose not only the memories of their confrontations with it, but also the memory of the bond that had united them since childhood. The friendship forged through trauma, fear, and survival gradually weakened, until it became a barely perceptible, almost abstract connection. This forgetting is not presented as simple erosion caused by time or distance, but as a strange, almost defensive mechanism of supernatural origin. Its function appears clear: to protect the human psyche, to prevent people from permanently bearing the knowledge of having confronted a cosmic entity, of having witnessed concealed deaths, tragedies disguised as accidents, and horrors that defy all logic. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is that not even Mike Hanlon managed to escape this process. Despite remaining in Derry as a librarian and guardian of the knowledge related to it, with the firm intention of watching for any possible sign of its return, Mike also began to experience a progressive loss of memory. Although he left detailed records of the town's supernatural history, chronicles of impossible events, and testimonies of the horror that had repeated itself for centuries, over time it became increasingly difficult for him to focus on those documents, fully absorb them, and retain that information clearly and consistently in his mind. What the novel suggests with considerable clarity is that Pennywise's continued presence in Derry did not function solely as a constant, latent threat, but also, in a deeply twisted and disturbing way, as a kind of collective psychological shock absorber. Its influence altered how the town's inhabitants processed reality, causing them to repress, with abnormal speed, the memories of the most atrocious tragedies, the inexplicable disappearances, and the violent deaths that repeated themselves generation after generation. Thanks to this mechanism, the most horrific events were pushed into oblivion almost immediately, diluted into vague rumors, forced rational explanations, or simple, uncomfortable silences. People carried on with their lives, returned to work, sent their children to school, and rebuilt after each disaster as if nothing truly extraordinary had occurred. This effect was neither a malfunction nor a coincidence. It was an integral part of the ecosystem of horror that Pennywise had carefully constructed in Derry. In fact, this mental filter was essential to the town's very survival. Without it, Derry would have been abandoned centuries ago. No one would tolerate living in a place where children regularly disappear, where fatal accidents occur with abnormal frequency, and where violence seems to emerge without explanation. By dampening the emotional impact of these tragedies, it ensured that the community continued to exist, grow, and reproduce, thereby guaranteeing itself a constant and renewable supply of victims to complete its feeding cycles. After the entity's definitive disappearance, this psychological mechanism did not vanish entirely. Rather than fading away along with Pennywise, it remained in a residual form, like an echo or reflection of its former influence. The people of Derry began moving forward by erasing from their consciousness not only specific traumatic events, but even the very existence of the supernatural horror that had dominated them for entire generations. Pennywise ceased to be a clear memory and instead became a diffuse shadow, an uncomfortable sensation that no one could precisely define. However, this process of forgetting carried extremely dangerous consequences. The collective amnesia was so profound that it left the population completely defenseless against any future supernatural threat. By erasing the horrors of the past, all accumulated knowledge that could have served as warning, defense, or preparation was also lost. Patterns, signals, cycles, and anomalous behaviors ceased to be recognized, and with them, the ability to respond to similar dangers was almost entirely nullified. In this way, forgetting becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allows people to heal emotionally and mentally after decades or centuries of constant trauma. It grants them an apparently normal life, free from the unbearable burden of having witnessed cosmic horrors that defy all human logic. On the other hand, it renders them fragile, vulnerable, and completely unprepared. The town is left exposed, without cognitive or emotional defenses, to the potential emergence of new dark forces. Although the novels make it clear that Pennywise's defeat eliminated its direct presence and immediate dominion over Derry, they also repeatedly suggest that the supernatural corruption it seeded in the region never fully dissipated. Evil did not disappear. It simply changed form, fragmented, and diffused into the environment. Various stories by Stephen King reinforce this idea in unsettling ways. In Dreamcatcher, for example, it is mentioned that a commemorative statue dedicated to the victims of the flood caused by the storm following its defeat was vandalized years later. Scrawled across the surface of the statue appeared a piece of graffiti as simple as it was disturbing: "Pennywise lives." This is not merely an act of juvenile vandalism, but a message loaded with implications, a sign that on some level, the entity remained present in the town's memory, or perhaps in its unconscious. Something similar occurs in the Knockers, where a character visiting Derry after its supposed death reports having seen, or believed he saw, a clown wearing a silver suit with abnormally bright eyes watching him from the sewers. Another character describes equally disturbing visions: red balloons slowly emerging from storm drains, floating in an unnatural manner. These episodes reinforce the sense that Pennywise's imprint has not completely vanished, but instead persists as a residue of horror. These details point to the idea that fragments of its essence manage to endure, either as remnants of its influence or as lingering echoes of its power. Moreover, the interdimensional fracture generated by its arrival and prolonged presence in Derry never fully closed. That tear in reality continued to function as a gateway between worlds, facilitating the manifestation of other supernatural entities capable of breaking into our dimension. The continuity of strange phenomena in Derry reinforces this interpretation. Even after Pennywise's fall, the town continued to be the site of recurring tragedies, inexplicable accidents, and outbreaks of violence far beyond any reasonable proportion. Although some events diminished, such as the systematic disappearance of children, the overall pattern of misfortune never entirely disappeared. Everything indicates that Derry and its surroundings were permanently marked. The narrative suggests that the region continues to experience abnormally high levels of domestic violence, accidental deaths, natural disasters, and social collapse, reinforcing the idea that evil, in one form or another, never truly left the place. Within the expanded universe of the Dark Tower, this interpretation becomes even clearer. In the novel Insomnia, we are shown that the Crimson King is able to exert direct influence over Derry long after Pennywise's defeat. His objective is to locate and assassinate Patrick Danville, a child whose ability to alter reality through his drawings makes him a key piece in the fate of the Dark Tower. The fact that the Crimson King operates specifically in Derry is no coincidence. The town remains a weak point in the structure of the multiverse. All of this makes it evident that, although Derry managed to free itself from the direct dominion and reign of terror imposed by Pennywise, it remained marked as a territory permanently affected by supernatural forces of immense power, a place doomed to continue acting as a magnet for entities that exist beyond human comprehension. And with that, we arrive at everything that is known about Derry's fate after the defeat of it, or after the supposed definitive death of Pennywise. Personally, this is one of the most intriguing, most tragic, and paradoxically least questioned aspects by many fans. There is a tendency to assume that once the creature was defeated, the town was left completely safe, purified, and free of any residual evil. However, the evidence scattered throughout the various novels demonstrates exactly the opposite. Derry continues to function as a point of attraction for cosmic horror and the supernatural. And perhaps the most painful aspect of all is that the members of the Losers Club ultimately forget not only what they lived through, but also the bond that united them. Victory comes at a price: the loss of memory, of friendship, and of shared identity. Although this ending fits perfectly within the lore of it, and Pennywise, it leaves a profoundly bittersweet feeling. Evil is defeated, but the world does not emerge unscathed. Even so, it is fascinating that Derry remains a place where the barriers between dimensions and the macroverse, or macrocosm, are exceptionally fragile. This condition turns the town into a true magnet for cosmic entities and horrors, opening up a vast range of narrative possibilities that could be explored both in future stories and in new cinematic adaptations of the universe created by Stephen King.